Welcome to Media and Monuments podcast, presented by Women in Film and Video in Washington, D.C. Media and Monuments is conversations featuring industry pros speaking on a wide range of topics of interest to media makers.
Welcome to Media and Monuments podcast. This episode is all about the profession of being a film critic. I am your host, Tara Jabbari, and I spoke with critics on several aspects of viewing and reviewing films. Our guests are Anne Hornaday, an American film critic for the Washington Post since 2002, and is the author of Talking Pictures: How to Watch Movies. In 2008, she was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism. Bob Mandello has been with NPR since 1984. He views 300 movies annually and covers the arts for NPR and shares critiques and commentaries on NPR's award-winning news magazine, All Things Considered. Bob, Anne, thank you for joining us. So I wanted to first ask you guys to give a brief little, how did you guys get into the positions that you're in? How did you concentrate on film criticism?
And ladies first.
Oh, you're too kind. I came in absolutely sideways. I was a freelance writer in New York in the 1980s, and I was writing about a variety of subjects, just trying to get gigs wherever I could find them. And that was a time when movie journalism and entertainment journalism was having a real heyday. It was when things like Entertainment Weekly was getting started and Premiere Magazine. And there was a wonderful local paper called 7 Days, edited by the great Adam Moss, that did a lot of cultural reporting. And so really it was following the outlets. And so I started doing profiles of filmmakers for Premiere. For the front of the book, they would profile professionals in the craft areas. So I interviewed casting directors and costume designers, the people that are below the line, I guess you'd call them. And in the course of that, I interviewed Albert Maysles, the documentary maker. And as I was finishing up my interviews with him, the young man who was handling his communications was a guy named Joe Berlinger. And he said, hey, that guy over there, and that guy being Bruce Sinofsky, he said, we're working on our own movie. When it's done, could we call you and could you write about it? And I said, well, call me when it's done. I'll take a look and we'll go from there. So I think it was probably, I think it was more than a year later, they finally finished it and did call. It was called Brother's Keeper. It was an amazing film. I loved it, and I did want to write about it. And this whole time, I'm still doing things for Ms. Magazine and Working Woman and Glamour and the Daily News. I mean, I was all over the map. They were showing it at Film Forum. They were self-distributing, so a national publication would not have been appropriate. But he said, ideally, we would have a piece in the New York Times Arts and Leisure section. And I said, well, I've never written for them. I've written for the book review. And he said, well, I have the number of the film editor there. And I this is the part that kids at home, this never happens. I cold called. The editor picked up the phone. That's preposterous event number one. And she allowed me to pitch her. And she said, why don't you write it on spec? I had written for the book review, so I was not a complete unknown quantity. But she said, write it, and if we like it, we'll print it, and if we don't, we won't. And I did, and I got in, and that's what started I started to write a lot for them about film and filmmakers. And so it was based on that reporting that I was hired at the Austin American-Statesman to be their film critic in 1995. I very much came in through learning about film on the job in terms of watching the movies that my subjects were making, watching their films, watching the films that influenced them, learning about how they did their jobs, sort of seeing them through the maker's eyes. So I think I never went to film school. I didn't study film in college. I came at it really as a writer.
Yeah, my story is very similar. I came to it from theater criticism. I discovered when I was a college student that if I claimed to be a critic, they would give me free tickets to things. This was very exciting, and I went to Arena Stage and a lot of other places on the free tickets, and I was writing reviews for the school paper at University of Maryland, the Diamondback. And I got out of college and then was trying to keep the free tickets going. By that time, I was also getting free film tickets. And so for a while, I worked for a chain of movie theaters in the suburbs here, Roth Theaters, throughout the 70s and into the early 80s. I worked for them, doing publicity for them and writing radio spots and that kind of thing. And at the same time, I was writing for every small newspaper that ever folded in Washington. If it was gonna die, I was its critic for the last 6 months. For theater, because it didn't make sense to do film for them because I was, as an advertising guy, I shouldn't be quoting myself in my ads, that kind of thing. So I was writing theater criticism locally. And one day, as I jumped from paper to paper to paper as they all died, one day there wasn't a paper to jump to. And I called up the local radio station because as I was listening to them, they had been using Frank Getline, who was a critic at the Washington Star, as a theater critic. And all of a sudden they weren't. They were using other people. And so I thought, oh, they must be trying people out. So I called them and said, could I try out? And I was lucky because Craig Oliver, the guy who was doing the hiring there, had been reading my reviews in all these small newspapers. And so I tried to reconstruct one of my print reviews for radio. And because I had been writing radio copy, I kind of knew how to do that. And so apparently they liked it and they put me on and I started doing them. I did that for about 6 months. And then one day I had an idea for a piece that I wanted to pitch to national public radio, right? The whole network, not just my local station. And so I called up the people at All Things Considered. What had not occurred to me, this is like 6 months into my doing it for WAMU, was that they were listening to my voice mixed in with their voices in Morning Edition. They were using me in the cut-ins as they drove into work. So when I called up, I got Susan Stamberg on the phone. That's my miracle number one. And she said, I said, I'm Bob Mondello. And she said, oh, I'm a big fan of yours. And I sort of shook my head and said, that was my opening line. And she said, why don't you come and do pieces for us? And I said, well, that was my next line. That's how hard it was to get into NPR at the time. So anyway, I freelanced for them for quite a while. And the first story I pitched was how Annie, which had come out as a musical by that time, was actually Oliver, which had just reopened on Broadway, in drag. And I thought they didn't know I was gay. So that started my career. That was in April of 1984. And I freelanced for them for years and years and years and years. And then they finally brought me on staff in 2000 as their first critic. Yeah, I know it is a long time. They basically... Yeah, it's complicated, but the union finally said, you can't keep using him like this. You have to actually give him a job, which was a wonderful thing. And I was the first critic that they had ever hired. Their rationale originally was that a critic offers opinion and that National Public Radio, which receives funding from all kinds of people, but mostly the folks folks at home who are writing it, ought not to be paying someone to offer opinion. Bringing me on, basically what they decided finally was that I was covering a beat, right? And that was not unlike a science reporter. I was just covering movies, and the way you cover movies usually is to talk about them in the way that I was talking about them. And so they brought me on. Now we have 5 critics, and so apparently I did an okay job.
Yeah. So for anyone who wants to become a film critic today, because you guys both sort of did a cold calling or, did it on spec and stuff like that. Do you have any advice or have you seen a trend happening that people should consider?
What's out there right now is blogs. There are an awful lot of bloggers at the screenings that we go to. Some of them are quite young. I think that's the sort of thing that you can do easily. The route I took has since closed because there really aren't the kind of alternative newspapers that I was writing for back then. I think working on reviews in college is a good thing to start with. I think that the answer to anything about journalism these days is to just start doing it. I mean, if you're doing it someplace, then you can kind of sell it to someone else. And I really urge people to write for every blog or every podcast or every kind of vehicle for getting the word out there that what you're doing. That's how I would try to do it now if I were doing it. It's a really different world. So
That's true. And I found that when I tell that little life story, just like Bob, very little of that is relevant to young people trying to break in. Like you said, Bob, I mean, none of those avenues, either they've dried up completely or they're so constricted. And of course, it doesn't help that you and I are hanging around, I mean,
I know.
it's unfortunately.
I'll give up the ghost fairly soon.
Exactly. But it is that kind of job. You can do it till you're into your dotage because it's not that demanding physically. So that's the bad news for young people. I do think, but even for like a legacy publication like the one I work for, though, we are constantly reevaluating like how best to do this job and how best to do it on multiple platforms. I try to check in to things like YouTube. Not that much, but I do try to kind of keep up on who's popular. I think there is space on YouTube for really thoughtful. I mean, I think people confuse criticism with opinion. And it's deeper than that. It's not it sucked or it didn't suck. It's not thumbs up, thumbs down. I mean, I think you have to bring a breadth of knowledge. I make kind of a stump speech about I am very much the product of a liberal arts education. I did not specialize in film, but I learned how to learn, and I learned how to think critically about any manner of things that I encounter in life, including movies. And so that I think that there is room, especially on YouTube, I think, for a really thoughtful, knowledgeable in terms of institutional memory, in terms of the movie business and references, to give a deeper, more profound, more, frankly, just a smarter take than just kind of a recap. Because I think, and that's another way in, though, is the recap business. I mean, we've seen this kind of proliferation of the recaps, and some of them are really clever and smart. And I think those voices will rise to the top.
Well, there's another facet to that, which is that I'm not absolutely convinced that film criticism, as we know it today, is a written form or a polished form in publications, is going to exist for that much longer. Because I think there are so many other outlets. If you go to Rotten Tomatoes right now, you can find 80 reviews of absolutely everything. The necessity for a publication to have a reviewer in the old sense is not what it once was.
Good point.
So I think it's plausible that the kind of criticism that is going to happen in the future is either academic or really, just sort of retail based. Whether the thumbs up or thumbs down thing. Was done originally by two very smart guys.
Exactly.
I mean, Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel were just amazing.
Right.
And when they did thumbs up or thumbs down at the end, it was nuanced after 4 minutes of conversation. Today, I think people are content to say, I liked it or I didn't. And that really is not, that has nothing to do with criticism. It is absolutely the least interesting thing about writing about something.
Exactly.
The way that criticism works, at least for me, when you go to something that you don't like, your evening is spoiled, and you go home and you really don't want to think about it. If you go to something you like, you can't wait to tell people about it, right? And that's how I go into every show. If there's something that I am having a good time at, I really can't wait to get on the air, because it gives me a chance to talk about the things that I think worked or why it excited me. And that's the kind of thing that I think you get later in life as a critic. That it isn't necessarily the thing that comes first, because initially you can wow people by being funny about the things you don't like. Right. And that is very appealing to a young critic, that the enthusiasm for things is something that you realize afterwards, because you love the form, because you could not go to the number of movies that we have to go to if you didn't love doing it, right?
Well said.
One of the things that I'm a little confused about is how all these different websites, Rotten Tomatoes, IMDb reviews, Amazon reviews, so forth and so forth. There's so many ways to learn, but the more popular ones, how do they aggregate? Like, some are just like everyday people, some are professionals. what is the percentage that we're looking at where it's a thumbs up or a thumbs down kind of deal?
Well, Rotten Tomatoes is pretty much all over the place. The one I'm fond of is Meta Critic.
Same here. Yep.
Meta Critic.
Because that has, now there's a snob factor there, I guess, because those are curated pieces that appeared somewhere in a publication. And so they may still have me in there. I don't submit my review, so I don't actually know. But their reviews are published in a variety of different publications. And then they do a sort of an average of what everybody said. And the review goes in and it has a number next to it, like 75 or an 80. Rotten Tomatoes is basically the thumbs up, thumbs down thing. It's affirmative or it's not. And they average those in some more complicated way that I don't really know. And the way that you can sort of turn Rotten Tomatoes into Metacritic is to hit the button that says top critics. And that tends to be people who are printed somewhere or on the air somewhere. And so that, that can help, I guess. I don't really know a lot of the sources that those come from. The Rotten Tomatoes has the advantage of being from all over the world. I've noticed Australian critics and Spanish critics and things like that in there.
And Rotten Tomatoes has really they've gone to a lot of effort to recruit voices in recent years, over the past 5 or 6 years, in the wake of Oscars So White and Me Too and Time's Up. And so that's where you're getting voices that maybe aren't attached to a recognizable publication, but they've come through that pipeline, which I commend them for. And I think it's interesting. I mean, I don't really, honestly, I don't read other people's reviews because I am so paranoid about unconsciously plagiarizing. But I agree that Metacritic is just easier to use just because it's a very clean design. And I have also felt that I feel well represented by them when they do assign those number values. And that's an interesting, I don't know how I think they just do data analysis,
Yeah.
But I feel I am impressed. And I've had at least 1 or 2 times somebody from Metacritic has contacted me to make sure that they're representing my sentiments accurately. And it was nice. And I've actually had really good communications with Rotten Tomatoes as well. Like they're proactive. I find they're accountable. There's human beings there, who care. But I agree. I think Metacritic it gives that more nuanced view, and it's just cleaner and easier to use. So I'm also a big fan of that site.
Now, for what it's worth, the public does not agree with us, and Rotten Tomatoes is enormously more popular. And I think if you're the nice thing about Rotten Tomatoes, if you're about to go to see something, is that you get a general consensus number at the top. And I'm not sure that people read more than the little blurb that's in the air balloon in their critiques. And if you don't read more than that, and again, I don't know who selects those. When I first started being in those sites, it was because NPR wanted me to be in them. So it contacted both of those sites. And then, they wanted me to assign numbers. And I said, I can't do that. I can't. I just can't. You guys do it. I didn't care if NPR did it. I figured they wouldn't misrepresent my pieces. But the thing is that those aspects of criticism, there was a guy named John Lawley in California, and I used to go on film junkets when I was a very young critic. And I met him one time, and he was talking about how whatever publication he was writing for wanted to put a star system with the reviews. And he didn't like that at all. But what he really didn't like was the fact that they wanted to call them lollipops, right? And they would have these little lollipops next to the review. And he said, I can just see the day that I'm reviewing something like The Killing Fields and I give it 5 lollipops. I mean, it would just be the most embarrassing thing I've ever done in my life. And I thought, yeah, that would be really terrible. And so we don't do anything like a star system for our reviews. What I'm trying to do on the radio, at least, is to give you a portrait of what I saw rather than what I thought about what I saw, maybe how it was done, how it was how the director conceived it, but not so much if I had a good time, because I just don't think that's an important aspect of it.
Now, I wanted to ask you guys, in today's age, especially when the pandemic hit, streaming services really grew. But even before then, you did not need to go to the movie theater to see something. And in the past, it seemed like there were the films made for TV critics, and then there was the movie theater critics. And now it seems like it's all jumbled together. Do you think there's a concentration for the different types of ways to watch things? The miniseries?
Actually, it's fun to hear you describe what is happening to critics today, because I'm thinking when I was a kid at the Washington Post, there was one guy who did theater and film. And his name was Dick Coe, Richard L. Coe. And I remember when they hired Gary Arnold to do film reviews, it was like, oh my goodness, you're going to have a separate person to do this form, right? Now, that's 100 years ago. You're both too young to remember it, but it's like I was startled by the division of labor at that point, because it was all a narrative performance form to me. Television criticism came along later, and they hired Tom Shales at the Post to do that. So, yeah, there's a division of labor at NPR. There's a definite division of labor. We have Eric Deggans, who does TV criticism, and I do film criticism. But we have Pop Culture Happy Hour, which has 3 critics on it who do both, and who don't worry about those kinds of distinctions in the same way that I do. For Eric and me, it's an opportunity really to avoid doing too much. I think he got the raw end of that deal, because there is so much on television now. I don't know how you keep up with all that, but I have a mere 300 or 400 movies to keep up with every year.
I have evolved in my thinking on this. Obviously, the pandemic kind of forced the issue, because we immediately pivoted to streaming, just as the filmmakers pivoted to streaming. I mean, that was a time when a lot of the independent theaters in DC began offering virtual cinema programs, and there was some good material on there. It was a revelation to me, because some of the first things I reviewed, I'm trying to remember the titles. One was Sella and the Spades, a really interesting movie on Amazon. There was that movie by the 2 young women about the murders in Maine, in that little Maine town, with Margot Martindale. And I mean, now these are films that had gone straight to streaming that in the before times I would not have reviewed, because they were not opening in a theater. Like, that was kind of our litmus test. That was our threshold. And I realized, like, wow, there's some really good work going through the festival circuit and then getting scooped up by streamers and not getting theatrical releases. So that was interesting to me. And a lot of those voices happen to be women and people of color, P.S. So that was an interesting pivot. I have now started calling it visual storytelling. I happen to be on the jury of the American Film Institute's annual AFI Awards, and they have always given 10 awards. They do 10 titles from TV and 10 from movies. And they keep them distinct, but in the last couple of years, we've all voted on everything. I think everybody's starting to evolve on this. In terms of how we divide the labor at the Post, Ingu Kang is our TV critic. We've never really been explicit about it, but I think kind of loosely, something that is a standalone feature film, whether it's opening in a theater or on a streamer, would probably be something that I or Michael O'Sullivan or one of our freelancers would do. And she would probably do series, something that plays more than once. But she's done her share of TV documentaries as well, which is also, that's a long tradition. So it's kind of ad hoc, I would say. But then we also don't get too hung up on doing, it's like if we both want to do something, then the more the merrier. I mean, I don't think there's nothing that would stop us both from weighing in on something either.
I think you can say that during the pandemic, voices of women and persons of color were elevated in the ecosystem. If you look at the Oscars that year, that first year, it was astonishing. All of a sudden, there were lots of persons of color nominated. That was the year of Ma Rainey's Black Bottom and Chad Boseman and all the things that were expected of that. But women were elevated in a really substantial way too. And my take on that, and I'm not sure I'm right, my take on that is that the powers in Hollywood who like Steven Spielberg, for instance, and had finished West Side Story and it was ready for release, and they held it for a year because he didn't want that to go direct to streaming. He wanted it to be in theaters, and the powers were mostly white and mostly male in Hollywood. And so the folks who didn't have the power to get out of the way of the pandemic in quite the same way, or to tell the studio what they wanted, tended to be women and persons of color. And so all of their material was suddenly elevated in the ecosystem of Hollywood, which was fantastic for them. But it meant that they were sacrificing, in order for them to have that elevation, they were sacrificing the dollars that would have come in.
So one thing is that now that things are sort of opening up again and stuff, there is that what needs to be seen in theaters.
Everything.
Okay.
You know, what's a great example of everything is Coda, because, you know, I think we do get kind of.
Did that go to theater? I only saw it on Apple TV.
Well, the first theatrical release it got was right when Delta hit. So it just never got but, you know, I saw that, and I'm sure Bob did too, at Virtual Sundance. And and so that's not a big spectacle. It doesn't have capes and unitards, you know, it's not a part of a franchise. It's not that traditional, you got to see it in theaters movie, but you do, because it's such an emotional experience. And I remember watching it all alone in my living room, thinking it would have played like gangbusters in an auditorium. It's just that kind of movie that would get cheers and laughs and tears, and it's just fun to have that experience with other people. And then immediately start talking about it after, you know, like Bob said, you know, you can't wait to start talking about these things. So you're right about everything. And those human scale, smaller narratives are just as, if not more so, I think, effective in a big screen collective context.
There's a mistaken notion that what the big screen has to offer is bigness, right? And what it has to offer is the collective experience of doing something, the communal experience of doing something with other people. And that, I mean, yes, it's wonderful to cheer something that is, you know, exciting in the way that a Spider-Man movie is exciting. But it's also kind of great to be wrapped up in the emotion when you feel 200 people around you, all of you choking back sobs at the same moment. That can be immensely effective. And I think people think that they can see films that are of a more modest scale in more modest circumstances because it's just easier. And I think that's unfortunate. I think that exhibition will continue. And I'm reasonably confident that it will continue in a pretty robust way, even for films that are basically art house films. But that's not going to be true everywhere. I think it'll stay here. It'll stay true here in Washington because we have, I don't know, 100 embassies and communities of people who speak different languages and things like that. It's always been a wonderful city for foreign films. But I wouldn't give my left arm on the proposition that this was also going to be true in Kansas City, right? I mean, it's different in other parts of the country, and I hope that the promise of the multiplex, you know, the original promise was we're going to give you 24 screens, and 16 of those are going to be for the big movies, and then there's going to be all these other little ones over on the side, and we'll play this whole big variety of smaller films over there, including foreign films, including indies. And what actually happened was that you had 16 screens with one movie, and the other ones are playing what else is commercially available in Hollywood. And that gets very frustrating for me. You know, if but I understand it from a financial point of view.
Well, if you talk to NATO, the National Association of Theater Owners, they will tell you, well, we want a healthy ecosystem. We want the bigs, the middles, and the littles. And when you think about some of the most successful movies pre-pandemic were middles, like Magic Mike and Girls Trip. These are those sort of wonderful one-offs that, again, you want to see with a bunch of people and laugh and whoop and holler and have a great time. And so I think, it's just the studios have to be in that business. I think that's kind of I'm a little concerned that the message so far is that only Marvel will get people back in theaters. That's why this Top Gun movie is so important, because that's, there's a crisis about getting older people back in. There's been a barrier there. And part of that is health concerns. Part of it is the habit that they've gotten out of, but part of it's just the movies themselves. There hasn't been that movie that, maybe Downton Abbey will be that one, the one that gets them back in, that they just want to go see. And I think, Spielberg thought it would be West Side Story. Unfortunately, that did not come to pass. But it has to be, there has to be a rhythm and there has to be a cadence of big, middle, and little that is a steady stream where people feel like they have choices and that, there is a reason to want to leave the house. Because I do think people, they still want to do that. There is this kind of, and that's why I think the Oscars, everybody was kind of complaining about, our movie's dead and this and that. It's like, no, if anything, the past 2 years have taught us people don't get turned on by watching them at home in their TV. Yes, it's convenient, and yes, it worked given our circumstances. But it's not like, I think people still do have that craving to get out and commune. So it just needs to kind of ramp up and again get that rhythm going.
Is there any final thoughts that you want to talk about the profession of being a film critic in today's age, how it's happened, where it's going, that we haven't really discussed?
I guess I would say, listen, there are very different styles of criticism. There are people who do the thumbs up, thumbs down thing. There are people, I've always described myself as a descriptive rather than a prescriptive critic. I think what happens in criticism a lot of the time is that, especially new critics, feel as if they have to sort of supercharge whatever they're saying with the kind of verbiage that would end up in newspaper ads that they don't run anymore anyway. So it doesn't make any difference. And so I think criticism of the sort that Anne was talking about, which is thoughtful and about analyzing the how and the, what's happening on screen and why it's happening and what the director intended. That has become something that is harder and harder to find. And that's a shame. And I'm hoping that you'll get another boost of it. I know that the people who come to me at NPR as student critics who come through the Kennedy Center's American College Theater Festival, who I speak to at universities, those people seem very engaged by the idea of doing the kind of analysis that we're talking about. But it's hard to find a place that wants it. And that's the trick. As the number of outlets gets smaller and smaller, it's harder to find places that want that kind of thing.
I still think, in this fire hose of visual storytelling that we find ourselves in, a trusted critical voice is still valuable. And like Bob, I try not to be prescriptive as much as just helpful without giving too much away. I've tried to avoid the synopsis, but just try to gently guide people to something they might want to check out or avoid. And I still think I think there's a place for that.
Thank you both for joining me. I'll try and go to the movie theater soon.
Well, if we accomplish nothing else, I'm pleased.
Please welcome back from our Oscars episode, Leslie Combamil. As a professional film critic and industry insider, Leslie writes, reviews, and conducts interviews for numerous sites online, including the MPAA's The Credits, and her own cinemasiren.com. She also is the lead contributor to the Alliance of Women Film Journalists website. Thank you, Leslie, for coming back on Media and Monuments podcast. Welcome back.
Thank you. My pleasure. I love being here.
So I first wanted to hear a little bit of your backstory and how did you get involved in being a film critic?
Okay. Well, I grew up watching movies with my dad and my siblings. And my mother died when I was a kid. And so I watched a lot of movies, watched a lot of cartoons with my dad. We watched Warner Brothers cartoons and some Disney, but mostly it was Looney Tunes. So that like the really famous ones from the 50s and Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner, mostly Chuck Jones that I remember. And then I went to school for studying film. I studied film studies and performance. I was a jazz vocalist and went to school for that, and also studied art. So kind of getting into all the different, types of art, that even really everything. I just love all things that have to do with performing art and visual art. And then when I got out of school, I got a job when there was an art gallery that was switching completely to animation art. And there were only 5 galleries in the world that sold animation. So I did a really deep dive and did a bunch of research and then became an expert at it. And at the time, there were lots of guys that were alive and who were animators. Chuck Jones was still alive, and Friz Freleng and Jay Ward, and a bunch of Disney animators. And because I've always been kind of a completist and really into research, I've always been a kind of book geek. I loved interviewing them, and I wanted to learn more. So I started interviewing them. And I was selling animation, and then I opened my own gallery, and then I was selling film art. And my focus was always the people that made the movies what they were, but nobody knew who they were. So I was really interested in people didn't know who the animators were. They didn't know how animation was made. They didn't think that animation cells were real art. So it's all about the stuff that people don't see as real art, but has a function. And so kind of from that, I started doing more research. And I've always been a feminist, like since I was literally, a teeny tiny. My dad tells stories about it. And so I was all along this time, I was researching women in film, female filmmakers, female directors and editors and production designers. And there were just none. There were very, very few out there. A few really famous ones, but not much else. And then not a lot of stuff about women, really. And certainly not very many that were written by women. So that got me interested in doing more research about all of that. And all at the same time as this was happening, I had to write a blog for my art gallery because that's how I was finding people and they were finding me. I always written, but I got more into that as my gallery was getting bigger and more well-known. And it kind of all came together when a friend of mine who worked at a newspaper suggested, because I knew so much about movies, that I started writing film criticism. And so I started doing it for a small newspaper near where I lived. And I really loved it. But what was cool about it for me is that I have only ever written reviews for things I want to write about. So I pick which films I review almost entirely. When I work with the Alliance of Women Film Journalists, I pick the films I want to review and part of the movie of the week. So we get that film to watch that has been sort of curated from a group of women that are in the Alliance. So I don't pick that one. But if I want to review a movie, I pick it. And if I want to interview someone, and my favorite thing in the whole world is interviewing people, no matter what their subject, what they're into. I love learning about people. And so I wanted to do more interviews, and I got hooked up with the Motion Picture Association, actually through a colleague / friend of mine, which was lovely of her to recommend me. And I get to pick who I pitch to the Motion Picture Association. It's a website called The Credits. It's all below the line artists. So I almost exclusively recommend female filmmakers and women below the line when I am pitching it to the credits. Now, sometimes there are people that come that I think it's just interesting, or a director who's a man that I think the film is interesting, or some cinematographers or composers, because I love music. Some male composers I will pitch. And like, I'm going to go see Top Gun, and then I'm going to interview 2 actors, which I almost never do. So I'm not that interested in the actors unless I think they're going to become directors. But the fact that what they did with Top Gun, when people are doing something new that's never been done before, I'm always interested in that. So that's a roundabout way of saying I kind of, all the stuff that I'd been doing in my career kind of allowed me to start writing about film. And then I got to interview female cinematographers and composers, which are the 2 lowest percentages that are being hired in the film industry. And then I, in my teeny tiny little way, I amplify these people who deserve recognition, who deserve getting hired more.
So it sounds like how you got your start into the film, being a film critic, is similar to how a lot of people are getting their start today. Just you were like a self-starter. You found an outlet. Like, did you start your own website to start being a film critic?
No, I wrote for a newspaper first, and then I wrote for some websites. And then I realized I just want to review films that I'm interested in. And so that's when I started really looking for, where can I write, where I can amplify female filmmakers. So it was, and then I made my own website. And at the same time as all this was happening, I have been having panels at San Diego Comic-Con for almost 20 years. And I started out doing them for animators, because I was experiencing having these animators that are so important to the history of film. They were dying because they're old, and they're so full of stories and fascinating information and innovations in the history of film and animation. And so I really wanted to get that information out as much as possible to as many people as possible. And I found that the best way for me to do that was to go to San Diego Comic-Con, where there's a gajillion people, and do panels with them. And I got in early enough that the folks who run San Diego Comic-Con know that I'm good at my word, and that I'm good as a moderator, and that I bring really good guests. And doing that for about 10 years, 12 years or so, I started thinking, can't I do this with female filmmakers? And so I started something called Women Rocking Hollywood. It's now in its 7th year, I think. And that has been female filmmakers at San Diego Comic-Con. I have a sponsor so that I can afford to bring them to San Diego. And then I film all of them so you can find them online. And I interview them beforehand so that, and they always have projects to promote. And so then I started a website called Women Rocking Hollywood. So I have Cinema Siren, that is where all the stuff, all the reviews that I do, I put on Cinema Siren eventually. And then I have Women Rocking Hollywood, where I talk about these female filmmakers, and all of the videos are on there. Of course, they're on YouTube too. But so I was doing that. And that's really when I decided to have websites, was when I had information that I needed to put all in one place.
With all the different ways to find films, how streaming services happen, and there would be a person who was just made for TV films, one for just the television series, one for films that go to the theaters, independent, not, things like that. I know it seems like it's a mishmash of everything. Plus, everyday people can kind of share their reviews of stuff, from Rotten Tomatoes to IMDb to Amazon, all these different things. What are your thoughts on that? What do you look for, or what do you recommend people to look for a good critique of a film?
Criticism only goes so far. I appreciate when people are reading me, but I think what they're doing when they're reading me specifically is they're looking for what I have seen that I'm wanting to even talk about. Maybe I've seen a movie I thought would be really good and it's awful. But I was interested enough in seeing the film in the first place. My fans and the people that read my stuff tend to be people who are interested in what stuff is she finding that I might want to check out. So I'm almost like curating a list of films or movies that I find interesting enough, which is why sometimes with my Rotten Tomatoes scores, they tend to skew to more positive reviews. I do see movies I hate, but if I'm interested enough to see it, then, and I also think, there's 200 or 300, sometimes thousands of people working on a film, and I'm not going to give it a pass just for that reason. But I do think that there are so many different kinds of film fans who love so many different kinds of film. And there are certainly movies that I hate for whatever reason. Generally, it's misogyny or badly developed characterization, or I can't see anything, it's too black, or you can't hear anything because now they've been, the way that sound has been sort of strangely morphed into this thing where we can't hear anything that's going on the screen. Those kinds of things are a concern to me. But even if I hate something, a lot of times I'll say like, okay, but here are the people who would probably actually like this movie. If you like blah, blah, you might, so in terms of the way I write and how I curate things, I try not to review anything that has no women below the line. I'm not really interested in something at this point. I mean, there are producers, and I think maybe the production designer, I can't remember, for Top Gun, there were not very many women. And then there are some movies that literally have not even the makeup. Not even the ones they've thrown us a bone for many years. It's all men. And I just feel like, those days are over. You can't do that anymore. That's like having no black folk and no diversity in your feet. You can't do that anymore. It's not okay. So those are things I try to avoid reviewing or even giving any time to, no matter how big a deal they are. And people who read my stuff, they know that. They know that about me. And they know that if I am writing about it, it's probably interesting enough to give at least a look to. Like I speak French, so I like movies that are in French that other people might not get the nuances of because the translation, the subtitles are completely off. So when I'm writing a review about something like that, I'm going to say, so, these are really close to what they're actually saying, or this is what I thought it was really funny. I'm not sure you guys will, because I was hearing it in the language, getting that nuance. So, I am pretty aware of the fact that, and then getting to the whole Rotten Tomatoes, people being able to put their, as an audience member, being able to put their reviews on those sites. Sometimes I have a really big problem with that because, for example, IMDb, and I don't know if they've changed this yet, but for a long time, they had no filtering system whatsoever. And you would find that films directed by women would be universally scored badly by a group of incel dudes who have just decided it's directed by a woman and I can't, we want to, vote it down. And that was happening a lot for a long time. And I think it still happens. So I don't know how that can be resolved. I want the audience to have an opinion, of course, but I also think that the internet in some ways can just kind of be the worst of us, represent the worst of us instead of the best of us. And then, there should be more people of color that are on Rotten. They've done a good job of trying to balance it out a little bit better. But, getting a wider array of voices speaking about the films. And, there are some movies that I can enjoy, but I don't really understand. I love that it exists. I love it if, for example, everyone is black in the whole movie, or everyone like Everything Everywhere All at Once. It was a joy to see Asian folk on screen almost exclusively. I love that. But I also will not be able to speak to the entire experience of what it's like for an Asian American or an Asian person to watch that film versus me. So I'm still coming at it from my perspective. And I think there are definitely gaps in film criticism and film journalism, because it's just as much of a problem for Black journalists and, intersectional female journalists to get a seat at the table when they're trying to interview, say, Tom Cruise. They might get, fourth tier of the film. They might be able to, and then the people that interview the really big people in the film or the director, they're not getting a chance to do that. And that's not cool, because how do you make it more balanced if you don't allow those voices a seat at that table?
Is there anything that we haven't talked about being in film critique profession that you think you'd like to add?
I think one of the things I always want to say anytime anyone's asking me about my film criticism and my journalism, I think what's really important is, if you love movies and you're on social media, to start doing, you don't have to do a deep dive, but do a little bit of research about, hopefully you care about whether there are women that are getting the jobs of, cinematography and a composer and all of the heads of department that have historically really been taken up by men, as well as female directors, to start doing a little bit more research about who is in this movie I'm curious about. Who's putting it together, how many women are below the line, how many people of color are involved in the film in terms of behind the camera. And also, is the story something that has value on a larger, bigger scale, or is it the same story that we keep seeing with the same people that we keep seeing it with? I think that's really important, is for people to do a little bit of research about these. It's easy peasy, man. You're standing in line somewhere, look it up on IMDb and see, how many women are below the line. And then if you find that you like some directors that are women, or you're curious about them, it's pretty easy to find them online, easy to find films that are streaming online. There are a lot of more indie focused streaming services online that you can find that will have some, because female filmmakers tend to be making films that are independent, because not that many women are getting hired yet to do films for major studios. It went backwards last year in the top 100 versus the number of women that were the directors of them. So, just to do a little bit of research. And then if there are people that you like, then seek out their films and see if they're on social media, so you can amplify and promote what they talk about, and celebrate them when they get their new gig, or when they get a first look deal, or any of the things that are really exciting to see when female filmmakers, especially intersectional female filmmakers, get hired, get a deal at one of the studios. That's a really big deal. And, it's not just 2 or 3. It needs to be way more than that, not just promoting the 2 or 3 that each studio chooses as their, token intersectional female filmmaker. We've got to be on social media promoting the fact that it matters to us, and that we support the studios that do that.
Well said. And my last question for you was, you were on our Oscar episode before the Oscars happened. Now that we know who won Best Picture, Coda, what were your thoughts on that?
I am possibly the wrong person to ask, since Sean Hayter was on my Women Rocking Hollywood panel that year. So I had already seen the movie. I saw it at Sundance. I thought it was wonderful. I think, the Oscars are really funny, because in so many ways, they really don't represent the best films a lot of the time. A lot of films don't get nominated, don't get any attention at all, that are really great. But every once in a while, there is a movie that actually makes you feel good and is also really good. So they don't always, feel good movies are not necessarily less valuable, less worthy. And I think this was a case where that film, it's also really strange to give one movie the best film because that's one kind of film, you know. On the other hand, Sean Hayter took a film that had been made in France and hired hearing actors to play deaf actors and was directed by a man. Now, granted, they wanted to redo it and they hired a woman and she said, let's get all, you know, deaf actors to do this. And I think that those kinds of things matter, you know, and that they do need to be celebrated. And so, you know, I'm a little bit conflicted about all awards, but because, you know, even if way more, talk about Cannes as a perfect example, you know, or my doing research on foreign film Oscar winners that were women. And it's like, I don't know, there were 3 ever, I think. So it just kind of, it's a grain of salt kind of thing. If it helps a movie get more recognition and get more, you know, wider viewership, then I guess that's great, you know. But on the other hand, Star Wars is a great movie. That can win the Oscar, you know what I mean? So it's just one of those weird things where it's just, you know, it's a popularity contest in a situation where there's a school full of different groups of people, all very valuable and interesting, and all could have their own little popularity in their own little group.
Thank you for coming back on, and it was really helpful to hear from your point of view.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Media and Monuments, a service of Women in Film and Video in Washington, D.C. Please remember to review, rate, and subscribe wherever you listen to this podcast. For more information about WIF, please visit our website at WIF as in Frank, V as in Victor.org.